Hello and most welcome to 1047b. I will continue with the modalities of thinking or modalities of being. This is corresponding to, or is even the same thing as the difference, so to speak, between being and beings. And when I say difference, it's not difference in an ordinary way, which is incredibly good and helpful pointer to what to look for. I mentioned the passive mode, and this is the default. This is what we have when we grow up. This is what we are. We are in the passive mode. It's very important to identify the passive mode, because by help of the passive mode we can get to the active mode. But if you look directly for the active mode, we will never ever find it, because they are interrelated. So any mode you can get into is very good, and the present mode is passive. I don't see any reason why you'll be looking at these videos if you're not passive at the beginning, and all Westerners are. Another helper here could be that in order to understand these things, you need to be passive in a way, so you wouldn't even be able to understand it. This is, the passive mood is denken, but it doesn't have any danken to it. There's no gratitude, it's tough, it's a chore. It is not light thinking. So although it's passive, that doesn't mean it comes about light. It is actually incredibly energy consuming. It takes a lot of effort all the time to uphold. It's a frictionful thinking. It's a thinking that is not something that brings happiness, gratitude, santosha. Sanskrit word that means like being satisfied with what you have. And that should not be given a Greek definition or concept. Being in gratitude with what you have is not instead of having things, it's a prerequisite to enjoying things. So it's not a sacrifice, it's actually just the opposite. In the old way of thinking, the Greek way of thinking, we have to give up all the time. And I'm not criticizing the giving up here. I'm just saying, if we don't have the right thing, describe the right thing, you won't find it, because these are rather complex things. And I would say one feature in the outcome, what is produced by passive thinking, is the idea that thinking itself is really easy. Although you spend a lot of energy on it, you think it's somehow easy. Well, we don't know anything else. It's like a blind might think it's easy to walk on the street. He has to move his cane all the time. That is, we are accustomed to it. And if you have a rucksack on your back your entire life, you won't feel it. It could even be that when you take it away, it won't be relief. It would take months. Yes, I'm quite certain of that. I will ask Jan Eiskens, the neurologist, But I think if you're carrying a rucksack long enough, it won't be a relief to take it away. Your system will be relieved, but you won't. And that's an odd thing. But the problem with Duncan, it doesn't think thinking itself is complicated. It doesn't think that thinking can have features, things to be known, properties. It is without properties. There are even people thinking all people have the same thinking somehow, same quality to their thinking. Although the content might be different, they all have the same thinking. This is not the case according to Heidegger or Derrida. It's never the case. That cannot be because we are different, we have different balance and so forth. The representation idea brings this idea that thinking itself is nothing to be known about. Maybe the content is important, but not the thinking direction or energy or what that is. And I would say the energy that what that is much more complicated and more things to be known there. It's a whole lifetime of learning, or several lifetimes if you're coming from Japan. And I'm starting to, little by little, understanding that. And it's a very tough thing to understand, especially for me, who were a representationalist. And as you will listen to the other lectures, I also met my Count Cookie. That will make sense later on. So thinking itself has no features. It's featureless in the passive thinking. That's one of the prerequisites, presuppositions, or needs to be put in place already. Needs to be there already. And it needs to be non-thought of. It needs to be the stratum you don't think about, where thinking is taking place. And this is exactly what the model subject in front of object in space means that space in itself needs to be unknown for it as to act as a dimension, so to speak, an x, y dimension to put the object in. It needs to be unknown. Has that feature of unknownability, to be like almost like a blank paper where you could put a diagram into. It needs to be blank. If it were to be a newspaper, the writings will sort of obstruct the diagram. So it's a prerequisite for many things we do, that we need to blank out thinking what it is. This is also ungrateful. This is not dangerous. It's just Duncan. Featureless. Almost transparent. Well, it is not transparent. It has many different qualities. They vary during the day. There are different energies going on. There are different things we can't think, for instance. Whereas in the passive thinking, it's like we can think everything. It's absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense to think that we can think everything. That would put thinking into the transcendental signifier, or make it unreal. Only things that are completely unreal can do whatever they want. We cannot. But putting thinking into the sphere, it can sort of fantasize, creativize anything. We are not heightening it. We're putting it on a king's role maybe, but it's an empty empire. It doesn't have any power there. And I would say that is exactly what Ian McGilchrist means with the emissary. We have ourselves made ourselves to slaves in our own empire. What is then the second leg of this? That's active and directed thinking. This is a thinking that is directed, that has knowledge. It knows its different modes of being. Let's say there are 12. Of course, there are much more. It's the morning thinking, it's the afternoon thinking, it's a directed thinking, We have logic. Yes, we do have logic, but logic as a projected thing, not first experience and then we put logic on top of that, which is like translating logic upon something that has already happened. No, this is it's almost like a pre-logic, but it is logic. It has all the traits of logic. Maybe it's the paraconsistent logic of Graham Priest, or the pre of that. Maybe it's the fifth corner. And that is very different from first conclusions are made passively by the passivity of the thinking process, and then we look upon what is done, and then we call it logic. It is a little bit like dipping your paintbrush into paint and splashing it on the wall and say that you meant that. That is actually, in many regards, modern art. It sort of live out the idea that we are only visitors to this planet, and the only thing we can hope for is that the human beings are projecting reality to reality. There's nothing real with reality. That is something we project to it. All relationship in the world, all sequences, all cause and effect are projected by us, as of course David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, Scottish/British philosopher, claimed. Active thinking is not that. That is actively putting up references, making comparisons, doing thinking, not after the fact. That is what means by projected thinking. Project it first and see what happens then. It has to be done in this order. This is an order that cannot be changed for obvious reasons. So in the beginning one might find, when we start with active thinking, that, oh no, it has so many rules, there are so many properties to learn, oh, it's hard for my brain. Well, in the passive mood you don't have any choice at all. It's absolutely zero. And there can be no awareness. We know today that Western man is not aware. He doesn't have any awareness at all. It is going from an unaware state to an aware state. And all those things that we say we have is because we want to have them, not because we have them. That's the difference. And it's very hard to discover this sequencing, that we put rationality, sequencing, cause and effect afterwards. Very hard to discover. And of course, the research subject in the Libet experiment, even when they were told, they didn't make a conscious decision, because it's too hard to discover. This is the Heidegger project, so to speak, to help these people be aware that there is a sort of a fault in the sequencing, and also pointing to the possibilities of actually being rational in your own life. And of course, a power-stricken person can be a person who wants to say that he has a lot of things to compensate, like the Emperor of Portugalian. And those illusory things we have to give up, maybe. Might be the case. We certainly feel that we need to be a part of democracy, that we are equal, that my social class doesn't matter, my income, my education or lack thereof, my intelligence or lack thereof, my physical stamina or lack thereof. Might all those have to be given up? But they're all proxies. They're all proxies. And that you cannot be told, but one can understand it And I think, sometimes I think that the Benjamin Levitt experiment should be enough. Of course you need to be emperor in your own life, not to decide about what you are, what's happening in your own life, not to understand anything and not having awareness. It's being simply like a robot. No wonder the experiment got so heavily attacked, and it became even furious when it was repeated over and over again. And in the end, and this is true, that research has been made of it, once one could no longer overturn the research result of Benjamin Levitt, most of the attacks ceased, and we went into a mood of forgetfulness. We wanted to forget it, to preserve the notion of some dignity. But we don't have to do that. We can actually gain all what we want, and we'll be lacking nothing. This is from Modern Perceptual Theory. This is what's shown by David Bradell. Perception is enough. To looking for something transcendental beyond perception is looking for something that doesn't exist. And of course such a quest cannot be satisfied. And most probably somewhere within yourself you know that. But once you have the fullness, you will of course never be interested in having those things anymore or dreaming for them. Well, you can have them, but they will always become secondary. I think it's absolutely nonsense to claim that it would be the case. The case that you need to be master over your own life and have awareness is completely obvious. It would be saying that a robot millionaire wouldn't like to be a human being because then he would lose his millions. No, it doesn't work that way. Best is to be aware and a millionaire. That is absolutely possible, of course. The two different modes give different results. This is also interesting to understand. You get different worldviews and you get different sort of logic that play into. And therefore, as I mentioned earlier, Heidegger should not make sense. That would be a really bad thing. An incredibly bad thing, it makes sense. Because he's speaking to something higher. Another understanding, a non-metaphysical understanding, to use his own terminology almost. That understanding will be closed off if you want to make sense to what he says. You can partly make sense to his sayings, and that would be enough for you to linger on. The first one, or the former one, the passivity, will give the classical physical world of things out there, and a logic that is not projected by always work afterwards, after the fact. This is what we mentioned before with Albert de Bono. What he said, that logic is a way of communicating, not to reaching result or reaching progress in thinking. And that means every point of thinking. And I would say that means especially perception, because putting those things afterwards would block out perception. To put you into a mood that is in the long sequence. Bad timing, yes, bad timing that would be. You would always be one step delayed. In this world of passivity, you are slouched, you are fallen together, and you will oscillate between a state of exaggerated tension and then going over in overly relaxation. It is a state of extremes. There is no balance struck in this system. It's constantly shifting between the tension of the negative and the relaxation of the positive. So the system will constantly shift between these extremes, and therefore there will be no rest, no repose. We mentioned rest before, and this is this lack of rest in the ontic realm. Person cannot be stable. There will be no permanent direction, which is the same. It would constantly turn. It would fluctuate, because in the passivity you have no possibility of localization. That is here, and you have no way of temporalization in a proper manner. That is now. Those two things will be gone. It is a little bit like firing a gun by chance, hoping to shoot the prey, sending out uncontrolled signals, because there's still signals coming out. You don't take the passivity that no signals are coming out. It's a different array of signals. 3 times as many of the nerves are still coming out, but they're sending out something else. And what that is still for science to sort of ponder about, but it's not enough to read off. It lacks the complexity, and it's more loop-like. You read off what you yourself sort of send out. So it's more of a closed sphere. So you don't reach out to the world, you don't know the world. And since you don't know the world, you begin to lack knowledge of the world. Once past per certain limit, now all we people in Western Hemisphere will reach that limit. And I think, my personal view, that happens when you are like 8, 9, 10 somewhere, where you notice your knowledge of the world is becoming so small that you give up seeking knowledge, and you let everything down to chance. This is exactly what Ian McGilchrist describes in his words what happens when the left hemisphere takes over. And it uses what the left hemisphere call intuition instead of thinking, rationale, logic. It is giving up, because the predictive power of the thinking you had is so low. It is not an ideological decision, it's a practical decision. It is not a religious belief, it is all down to survival. You get scared in your system. It's the flight and fight response, because you have so little information of the real world that you need to let everything go, because you know when you use your left hemisphere, the repetitives, it will lead to even greater trouble. Therefore, you need to leave everything to chance, and that is scary. So we live in a constant state of fear, and we know that. I mentioned that the absolute majority of people in the Western Hemisphere have a dominance for the N2 neurons and the T2 muscles. And the more you get into this, the more scared you be, and the less knowledge you will have. But you stop somewhere to seek knowledge. Then you have to reuse the old knowledge, the stale knowledge, the knowledge of the past. And this is what is called fossilization. This is when we can no longer change. And in language that usually comes about when you're 12. But in thinking it could come much earlier. We're giving up. There was no use thinking. I tried so many times. And the scary result made me refrain to intuition. Intuition is always the working tool for the left hemisphere. Always is in the end intuition. And then everything is put after the fact into costume of logic, rationale, to convince oneself and other it was on sound grounds. So then that's the forgetfulness, that you give up the world, so to speak, and you remain in a fantasy. Nothing would become correct anymore. The right hemisphere can do correctness. This other mode of thinking, which I call passive, cannot do correctness because it's too late. It's too late, it's not localized, and everything is on the distance. So it's like having a pair of glasses that belong to your grandmother, and you can't see anything, and then after a couple of years of using the same glasses, you start to fantasize about what could be out there. But you're on very sound grounds, you're too scared to use that, because you know that won't be enough. There is no information in that to lead your actions. So it's better to chance. And this somewhere, those distinctions become nonsensical, like the inner and outer world being absolutely different. And then you put in extra divisions where there already are divisions. And this doubling of reality, it's a defense mechanism. And I know most New Age literature attack this. That is so stupid, because that's a defense mechanism. This is what we do to defend ourselves. So you're making the person even more scared, even more afraid. And of course those people write those books or do those seminars or whatever they are for lack of knowledge. I wouldn't say I have knowledge, but somewhere when you start reading Heidegger, you understand that's a rather mighty project to go into that other realm. And it's somehow isn't not easy to understand that something that's habituated since decades would be so heimlich to us, so certain. So we feel so at home in that. So we need proof to get us out of that. And this is how I've been working, using proofs, seeing to things that show that we are not happy in the culture we are. And I think that slouching is hurting your own body, for instance. That's an absolute direct effect of passive thinking. Because if you stand balanced, your whole nervous system will take in everything. And that would just feel scary for the moment. You are not in the habit of computing that. So you will escape back, which is absolutely natural. Continue to do that. Once you get a taste for reality, it's like getting a taste for ice cream. Maybe you never tried ice cream and you need to get used to liking it. Not because in your case you don't have taste for it, more because it's a new taste. It's delicious. And this is absolutely delicious. It has nothing, so to speak, doesn't have any bitter taste to it. It's not like garlic or truffles. And I know another very grand understanding here is, of course, the Klein bottle. That shows our predominant idea of space is after the fact. Nobody can perceive three-dimensional space. Therefore, on the Klein bottle space we put the three-dimensional space. But it doesn't fit at all. It doesn't have any fitness to it. That's a random take of space. That means your whole body, your whole senses, kinesthetical, proprioceptive system will be out of balance. It will not be in the right region. Here I come to the next paragraph. It's the overlaying of perceptual gestalt. If we don't take perception to be direct, that we can actually perceive the world as it is directly, there will be no sound sending out. I would call it sound sending out. That your sending out will not be a sound, healthy. It will not have the complexity enough to read out the external. And that's the externality in time. You don't learn by time. And we show time and space are helping each other to perform depth. But you will be out of sync, you will be out of that energy that time gives you. But neither will you know where you are in space, and that is 100% literal. Non-modern Western people are located in space. Their location organs are not working properly. The proprioception, the free organs in the inner ear, it's very interesting, very important, especially for Heidegger, because no understanding whatsoever can come of Heidegger until we sort of balance those up, because they don't make a difference between inner and outer. Not that nonsensical inner, that this is completely out there and this is completely in there. They are participating, and by being both we can make a division. But if you make a division beforehand, no true division can be made, and therefore we jumble them. It's this sloppiness of the metaphysical presence. And one could say the sending out when it's sound is iterative, is iteration, constantly different, whereas the normal try to be repetitive. And repetitive doesn't have really any equivalence within physics or the world. So see repetitive not as a thing you can actually do, but it's the lack of being able to do something, the lack of power. Because being iterative is the power to all structures in the world, but being repetitive becomes really weak. And it doesn't matter if it's an iterative thought, projection, perception, or part of reality, it will always be weak. We talked about that earlier with the fern. A fern that is not iterative is incredibly weak. The iterations are there for a purpose. It's Mother Nature building structures, and we should build our own structure in an iterative way. But repetition is the lack of balance, the lack of strength, the lack of permanence, the lack of consistency, directionality, and I would say extension too. You don't extend into space if you don't have this iterative course. Repetition is the sort of antipolar to everything good in the world. It's the absence of structure or stable structure, because structure often gives the idea that it's something repetitive. It's not. It's weakness. It is only a differentiated wave in the heart that's sound. Too repetitive, it's the sound or the wave, which is the same thing of a malfunctioning heart. That's a heart that doesn't work. A non-working heart but this double take of trying to hear something after you heard it and trying to sort of sharpen your hearing and saying, who is it? How did it sound? What did he say? This is exactly the same as somebody speaks to you and you can't hear, and you try to sharpen your hearing somehow. This is what you think you're doing. And you're trying to make out the words. But this sharpening is not a sharpening. It's an overtension. It's a pre-grabbing. And that, as you know, after you ask 3 times, you won't hear what the people are saying. Try that out, or if you have experienced it, remember it. It happened to me. Somebody repeated something 3 times, and then I could not hear what he was saying. And it turned out to be due to that he had an incredibly slight accent. and he made it worse by just repeating the word which had the mad pronunciation in it. It was very little, and he got more and more embarrassed because I was a speaker of Swedish and he had this tiniest accent. I couldn't hear what he said anymore. After the 5th time we gave it up and somebody else said he said that word. So sharpening of the ear, trying to hear, this is this trying to perceive. And I read this incredibly stupid New Age book, Don't Try, which makes everything even worse. There is not anything non-trying, it doesn't exist. What would that be? It is just trying, projection, but it needs to be first. This is how you perceive. Those people are, I think they're inspired by Fritjof Capra, one of those others. There's a misconception. You need to project, but then you need to let go. And that anxiousness of not hearing, not understanding, that fright, that horror, that scare that we all Westerners feel, that is what makes us preemptively wanting to take things. We can't give that up. It's nonsense to tell to a person who's afraid, don't be afraid. Like telling someone who's overly stressed, don't be that stressed. Doesn't make any sense at all. All of West we are bathing in bad advice. And I think there are 2 reasons for that. First, we think the whole thinking module, the spiritual realm, is something transcendental, non-existent. You can apply any features to it, whatever you make. Like a continent that doesn't have any features, and you go there as a geographer and says, there's a mountain, there's a lake, that's okay. Will that work? No. There are features in the mind. That's how it could be in mind. There's no features to it, there is no mind. As simple as that. So of course it has features. And those features are not limits. It's just the sheer opposite. The fixatedness of the mind, or the limitations, the contours. This is what Stephen M. Rosen meant with Aporia. It's the fright of knowledge, the fear of knowledge, or the unreasoned fear of knowledge, because that's the only place we don't have to fear. That's knowledge. That's where all the juicy parts are. But we're so stuck in repetition and idea of structure, and we don't even know what that is. So we need to sort of venture into that alley to understand structure. And once we do, we will understand that true structure is the good thing that makes stability, permanence, understanding, logic, rationale, ability to perceive. And of course we can get even more stuck in different modes. Possibly done by this Count Cookie, I don't know, but let's play on that in the other lectures. But this will be a double take from this, and that is that we become bystanders to our own reality. That would mean that our perception will be relayed, will not be direct. It means it has to go through a filter. That filter is the repetitive, stern, passive perception. And we will be clinging to previous experience, since we don't get any freshness in the new happening. The second is that observation and categorization will be let out as a possibility, since the passive mode suggests that all experience should be pure, and that if we are aware, we would make double take. This is the second double take. So we in the Western metaphysical realm thinks by projecting we're putting something on reality, when it's actually exactly the opposite. And then in the second place, then we reach out, and we are not aware of that, but we have to do something, and we do too late. And then we actually do capture reality, or we being biased with reality. But we're not aware of that, therefore no one can point it out. But usually within Western literature, the good things that could be beyond the limits of metaphysics or presence are criticized. We are asked to stare away from that, go away from that part. Do not project, be unbiased. There's a good reason, because the metaphysics of presence is defending itself. This is how we structure our understanding. And if you are in it and write that, you will defend it. This is the gesture that Derrida is talking about. It's always present there. And that's the one to establish a center beyond centers. A center beyond real centeredness. Divisions beyond real division, and so forth. All writing will be of that character. There will always be a defense for the transcendental signified. But if you can, my opinion is, if you can keep that to an absolute minimum as Heidegger did, I think that is good. That's a very good start, and I think it should be there. It would be too alien for, not too alien, it wouldn't make any understanding possible. I think so. But of course, in the metaphysical presence, the literature of New Age and so forth, it's always criticized projection, of course, because they're defending the metaphysical presence. And the second take is, then there is nothing written at all about the waiting. That second part is not observed. Nobody knows about it. And that, I think, is something that only Heidegger points out. And that's the forgetfulness of the why question. In the first, we can have the why question when we project. Once the projection is made, passive or active, in the case passive, then there are no more questions to be asked. So the second is a big blank. And then we're not aware that we are subverting reality. That's why the criticism of bias is true to a certain extent, but is put in the wrong place. It's put in a place that we should have projection, and it's not pointed out because we don't know anything about the second part, the waiting part. And of course, this is something that Ian McGilchrist called waiting for the effects, although he doesn't really say how we could get to that. But marvelously acknowledged and understood by Ian McGilchrist in his fantastic book that I'm continuing to read. It's very good. This passive attitude is the attitude of the left hemisphere. It's a certain attitude, it's a collapse, it's a non-loving, unethical way of being to the world, not caring for it, kein Sorge. But I don't agree with Ian McGilchrist in the criticism, because we don't have any choice. And this might be criticizing too much something that we can't simply help. What's the use of criticizing someone who can't find water, who can't speak language, or is disabled? We're stuck. One could feel sometimes offended when he criticizes his professors who took a poem apart. I think they were choiceless, and I would have done the same thing at that time. No, we need knowledge, and this is what Heidegger and Derrida is sort of providing. Once we do this in the right order, and we sort of understand that out of sync, that delay of reality doesn't have to be there. And I think that's done when we understand it could be a second part. And in the second part, what we do, this is to be discovered, we don't know about that, is we're being too anxious, we're being too greedy, something in that vicinity, but it's happening so quick it is impossible to stop. But I think as it suffers to this level, this pre-check of the sensory information is really good, really firmly established in the research literature. We know that this is happening, and it's happening to a much greater extent in humans than in animals. We can sink to a lower level, but we can also heighten us to a higher level, and I think that is absolutely possible for everyone. Because when we let something be, we can then take it apart, like the poem, we can analyze, we can intellectualize, but that would be true analyzing, intellectualization. Well, it'll be the same thing, but now it will have the sharpness because the material it's working with will be fresh, it will be accurate, it will be having energy to it, it will be satisfying. That would be denken, not danken. And we will know it's true as well, because we don't have to use this set of rules to know when we're true or when we're right. Set of rules that are bound always to change, and thereby making us even more uncertain of our truthness. So this is to gain, and I would say there is a lot to gain here. It's not half bad actually. We have the whole world to gain, whereas we make that possible for us. There is no loss here. And we don't need to change intellectualization, analyzation. This is what we gain. So we get from the Indian literature the ahamkara to work more perfectly. We get the chitta, the awareness that sees above. And we get the body of the intellect that tries apart and can be perseverant, can be persistent. Chitta helps there to understand that we change our rules. Living in the passive mood, we don't know when we change the rules. To some extent we might know, but it's like having a diet and you think you're keeping it, but in between you're munching on things. This is what's happening in the passive mood. You change during the days, during the weeks, the months. You are like Bertrand Russell, here, there, and there is no chitta, there is no awareness to tell you this is happening, and there is no body to take that apart, to analyze it. This is the proper use for analyzing. Don't criticize analyzing itself. Now that might be problematic because we need that too. And I would rather say that instead of saying there is an overuse of it, it's a lack of use of it. I think that's lack of knowledge and information that makes us overuse it. And there is another thing altogether. Let's look into the why question, and a lot of things will be understood. I will start a little bit by reading how this also comes to physics, and I will put in a second word here, and I'll be speaking about fear. We need to make difference between different fears, and this is also a word of Heidegger, and I would read once more from this Dictionary of Heidegger. to end the thing before. Fear is important. Fear makes us strive into those things. It's not our fault. And I think most New Age literature, and also maybe to some extent modern writers, there is kicking on the poor fellow who can't help himself. That could be me as well. And this kicking effect, when there is knowledge needed, is like a little bit burning children that went too close to the fire or something like that. Let me quote here from the dictionary: angst, fear, boredom. German has a variety of words in the area of emotion. Leidenschaft, which is passion; affect, which is affect, emotion; Gefühl, which is feeling; and Stimmung, which is mood. Heidegger often distinguished them, and a current affect such as anger or wrath, Zorn, is quite clear, different from a dispositional. This Zorn, which is like an anger or wrath, is different from a dispositional Leidenschaft, such as hatred. Hatred is a clear-sighted, never blind. Only wrath is blind. Love is clear-sighted, never blind. Only love's ardor is blind, fleeting and spasmodic, and affect not the passion. To call passion a feeling seems to weaken it, but this is because we have a degenerative concept of Gefühl. In fact, a Gefühl is the way in which we find ourselves in our relation to beings, and thus also in our relations to others. Gefühl is here equivalent to Stimmung. The feeling is not something that takes place in the interior. Feeling is the basic mood of our Dasein, in the virtue of which and in according of which we are always already raised way beyond ourselves into being as wholes, as they matter or do not matter to us. The body is intimately involved. Every feeling is bodying, Leiben, tune in a certain way and mood that bodies in a certain way. Gefühl is sometimes uneasily equated with Stimmung, sometimes distinguished from it as purely inner feeling detached from any object. Let's go into the juicy detail. Fear discloses the world in a special way and is close to yet distinct from. Angst, which is anxiety, unease, malaise. Fear is angst that is fallen on the world, inauthentic and concealed from itself as angst. What I fear is an entity within the world, e.g. a dentist drill. This entity is detrimental. Detrimentality is a mode of involvement, bewandtnisat. The detrimentality is of a definite sort, pain in the tooth, and comes from a definite region, the dentist. The region of what comes out of it are familiar to me as scary. The drill is not yet on my tooth or nerve, but is coming closer. It's already nearby. Next month's appointment does not bother me. It threatens, but is not certain to arrive. I may need no feeling. It may not hurt if I do. The uncertainty persists until the last moment. The uncertainty intensifies my fear. I do not fear the drill simply because of the pain I expect. Some people do not fear the dentist drill. Some perhaps fear nothing at all. They may expect the same intensity of pain as I do, but they do not view it as fearsome and do not pay it the same attention as I do. Since I do not fear spiders, I'm not fearful as I approach the sink in case one is lurking there, nor do I expect to encounter one, though it's not unlikely that I shall. Fear is not just an inner feeling, it opens up a world of potential threats. My slumbering fearfulness, my susceptibility to fear, has already disclosed the world as a realm from which such a thing as the fearsome can approach. What I fear for is myself, Dasein. Even if I fear for my house and my home, I fear for myself as a concern for being alongside. If I fear for others, I also fear for myself. Sich fürchten, usually just an intensified form of fürchten, to fear. What one is afraid about is one being with the other who could be torn away from one. It's the fear of losing one. How do I fear for myself? If I buy life assurance out of fear for my family's future. Fear is thus a state one is in. It discloses the world, one's thrownness into it, and the involvement of entities within it. Angst too is the state one is in, but it differs from fear. What angst is about, before which, in the face of which, is not an extra-worldly entity, but the world, being in the world, Dasein itself, or nothing. It threatens no definite harm. It's indefinite and lacks involvement. Only intra-worldly entities have involvement here. Hence Angst strips the world of its involvement totality. Its significance making the world as such all the more obtrusive. Dasein too loses its usual concerns and is individualized down to its naked self, its bare ability to be, its freedom of choosing itself. In Angst we find everything uncanny, unheimlich, unhomely. We don't feel zu Hause, und zu Hause. In the world, what Angst is for, it's worum, about which, is the same what it is about, Dasein and being in the world. Angst is calm and collected, while fear makes us lose our head. Angst has two contrary effects. One, constant implicit angst makes us flee from ourselves and take refuge in or fall into familiar intra-worldly things. Two, occasional explicit angst rips us away from the familiar and discloses bare Dasein and its bare world. Explicit angst serves the philosopher in two ways. A, in general it reveals Dasein in its unity. B, the philosopher's own angst detaches him from worldly concerns and prejudices, making philosophy possible. Angst is not the only basic mood. Boredom, Langweilig, also discloses beings as a whole by letting everything sink into indifference. But unlike Angst, it does not let them slither away and does not reveal the nothing. There are three progressive deeper types of boredom, exemplified respectively by waiting on a deserted platform for a train, which Heidegger unwarrantedly assumes needs to be late. Page 159, which the author points out. Going to a dinner party or walking the city streets on a Sunday afternoon. A deep boredom akin to angst. Langweilig is literally long while and thus more explicitly temporal than angst. Later, the dominant basic mood varies historically. The basic mood of the first versed Greek beginning was astonishment, while the basic mood of thinking in the other beginning vibrates in the moods which can be approximately called fright, erschrecken, restraint. These together are foreboding, Ahnung, and timidity, scheu. Fright makes us shrink back from the fact that beings are, and that being has abandoned them. More than one word is needed for the mood. Every naming of the basic mood in a single word is misleading. Every word is taken from the tradition. That basic mood of the other beginning has many names, does not conflict with its simplicity, but confirms its richness and strangeness. Modernity tends to lay every mood bare, or let it hang out, to make them public and communal, thus disguising the growing void. But angst before being is greatly to diverse ever. Proof: the gigantic apparatus for shouting down this angst. So Langweiligkeit, I certainly agree, is a thing of fearing being lacking beingness. And that the why question, the being, stop meaning anything to us. We can only ask the what, where, how questions, and we cannot even ask those questions in a way that could be answered in a non-decisive manner. We lose our presence in the world, and that brings about Langweiligkeit, which is like a, I would call it like a light fear, like an anxiety of light mood. It has a temporal aspect, and the fear is being a long time in the world who lost its being, or whose being we don't know. Lost its being, I think is more correct. Want to be correctly Heideggerian. It has lost its being, it's no longer with us. We don't know the features, we don't know the color, we don't know the where, we don't know the when, what it is for us. It is completely unknown. And that is that slight fear. And that fear we are so used to, and we call it boredom. And I think that's correct. And I actually had a nice parallel there to what the enormous research project of Ian McGilchrist has found out. And that is that boredom is a new thing. It becomes mentioned frequently in the mid-18th century, and then it progresses towards the end of that century. But it is effectively a very new thing. It comes into action, becoming stronger and stronger during the 18th century, and a long time with Langweilig make up for depression. In the end, it is like the wind eroding the cliffs, something I experienced myself for the first time only a couple of months ago. I didn't know that exists in Sweden. I thought our cliffs was too hard, they were not made of calcites, so they could not be affected by the winds. Yes, to my defense I can say that was an unassumed assumption, but it's still an assumption, so I'm still 100% guilty. And once I discovered that, it was a relief, not because I now could talk about it, but because I now know the things more. And it's not that detailed things in itself, that also the hard cliffs of Sweden are objects to wind erosion, but which if somebody asked me, I would have directly answered yes to, of course they are. But I didn't know it experiential, and that's quite different. It's not the same thing. And I think that's a big problem. Heidegger's pointing to something very interesting there, and he's the only philosopher that has ever done that, except from what E. McGilchrist wrote in his book Matter of Things. That is not in master and his emissary. And that is that we get so much knowledge from school and everything, and we have that knowledge, and it's true knowledge to a certain extent. But we don't know that ourselves. So then when there is a departure, it doesn't work, and that we don't know what is true knowledge. For me to truly know that the wind erodes the cliffs, I need to also experience it. Need to be there to experience it. Well, I need to be in the world. That's more correctly. Yeah? Now, if I'm not in the world, which I'm not, then it will not be something for me, and that will build up this fear that the being has lost their being, their features. And I would say that is exactly what Nietzsche is pointing to in his book, Gay Science. And that is that we lost all our knowledge. It can only be indirect. I don't think it can only be indirect. We can have two strands of knowledge. And by being certain of the world, the direct experiential things, we can strengthen the other things we got. One need not exclude the other one. And I saw this firstly now, isn't it? This random place has this thing here. And in this case, it's either a rabbit or, it's not a duck, it's a hand. This is reality. The one doesn't exclude the other, they complement each other. That deeper knowledge, that Nietzsche felt to be lacking in the world. But Heidegger shows us a way of reaching that one, that we can get rid of the Langweiligkeit, that eroding tendency in our lives that ends in melancholy depression. It takes years, of course, but it will end there because it erodes our sense of realness. It erodes the sense of the realness of the world, of ourselves, our Dasein, our interaction with others. It erodes that slowly, like the wind on granite. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon.